Despite record levels of employment, all was not rosy in the UK labour market on the eve of the Covid-19 pandemic. It feels as if we're once again reaching a turning point in the UK labour market, with inflation soaring and real wages plummeting. And an economic downturn on the horizon threatens employment prospects and economic livelihoods of many. In understanding the state of the UK labour market now, it's helpful to look back at the 5 years leading up to the eve of the Covid-19 pandemic in early 2020. Our research assesses employment policy developments and labour market outcomes under 3 different Conservative Prime Ministers between May 2015 and the eve of the Covid-19 pandemic. We identified 2 key areas where progress had been made, but these contrast with 3 key vulnerabilities. There were 2 positive developments. 1, employment reached record levels. On the eve of the pandemic, employment had reached record levels. At least for women, employment rates had been higher for men in the 1970s and late 1980s. By the end of 2014, employment rates had recovered from the economic downturn that had followed the 2007-2008 financial crisis, and rates continued to increase between 2015 and 2020. 2, earnings inequality fell. Earnings inequality fell after the introduction of the national living wage in 2016. The higher minimum wage for employees aged 25 and over reduced earnings inequality in hourly and weekly pay by compressing the lower half of the earnings distribution. Between 2015 and 2019, earnings inequality fell further and faster than at any time since at least the late 1970s. The higher minimum wage increased earnings and reduced the taxpayer's subsidy to low-paying employers, with no evidence that the higher minimum wage led to a reduction in employment. There were 3 areas of concern. 1, there was a lost decade or more of wage growth. Real growth in average wages since the 2007-2008 financial crisis can at best be described as sluggish, with average real wages falling in some years. Average real gross weekly earnings of employees working full-time increased in the 5 years up to the Covid-19 pandemic, but remained lower than prior to the financial crisis. This had a knock-on effect on living standards, leaving many households lacking financial resilience on the eve of the pandemic. 2, inequalities between groups and regions remained stubbornly high. Large regional disparities in employment remained, although there were relative improvements in some parts of the UK. In other parts, high rates of unemployment and low-wage employment persisted, for example in the northeast of England. Ethnic pay gaps also persisted, with lower average wage rates for most ethnic minority groups relative to white British employees. Bangladeshi and Pakistani employees, particularly women, experienced the widest pay gaps. Despite some convergence in employment rates between people with disabilities and people without disabilities, the employment gap between these groups remained large at over 28 percentage points. These inequalities meant that groups and regions faced different risks on the eve of the pandemic. 3, rising in-work poverty meant that work was no longer providing a secure route out of poverty for many. Despite real increases in minimum wage rates and a decline in earnings inequality, in-work poverty increased. Furthermore, a large proportion of workers in in-work poverty were working full-time, and this proportion increased. In 2017-18, nearly 2 million full-time employees were living in poverty. Cuts to in-work benefits and rising housing costs disproportionately affecting lower-income households are key contributory factors to this upward trend. So where does this leave us now? Despite record levels of employment and falling earnings inequality, improvements in living standards were curtailed by more than a decade of lost growth in average earnings and cuts to in-work benefits. Government schemes to protect jobs and support living standards during the pandemic were largely successful, although some groups suffered more than others, often exacerbating inequalities present before the pandemic. Now we have rapidly rising prices, which are eroding living standards, and real wages are falling faster than at any time since comparable records began in 2001. While there is a limit to what employment policy can do in the face of the current economic shock, policies to help the most vulnerable should include 1. Boosting the adequacy of in-work benefits. 2. Ensuring minimum wage rates keep up with inflation. 3. Investing in skills in lower educated workers. 4. Strengthening welfare to work programs.